Good morning. I am calling to order the Finance and Administration Committee meeting of the Board of Directors for Marin Water. It is October 27th, 2022, and our first item of business is to call the roll.
Director Bragman, he is absent. Director Russell.
Here.
Director Schmidt.
Here.
Vice Chair Gibson, he will not be here, and Chair Kohler.
I'm here. Okay, next I need a motion to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
So moved. Second.
Do we have any public comment on the agenda?
There are none.
Do we have any board comment on the agenda?
Nope.
Then I need a roll call to adopt the agenda.
I see Director Bragman.
Aye.
Director Russell.
Aye.
Director Schmidt.
Aye.
And Chair Kohler.
Aye. Okay, do we have any comments on items not on the agenda?
There are none.
All righty. Moving on to the regular calendar, I'm looking for a motion on to approve the minutes of the last meeting of September 22nd.
So moved.
Second.
Do we have any public comment on the approval of the minutes from September 22nd?
There are none.
Okay, then I'm looking for a roll call vote.
I'm assuming Director Bragman, you're abstaining.
That would be correct.
Director Russell.
Aye.
Director Schmidt.
Aye.
And Chair Kohler.
Aye. Okay, that brings us to the monthly financial update. This is an information item.
Yes, thank you, Chair Kohler. My name is Brett Uppendahl. I'm the district's finance director. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen here for the presentation. Hopefully you can see that here now. So today is October 27th. We are providing a finance update as we do each month. This looks back as to the results as of September 30th. So that represents the first quarter of our fiscal year, or approximately 25% of the fiscal year. My first slide here is an overview of our revenues at kind of the high level view of them. And similar to the last few months, it appears that the operating revenues are tracking as one would expect, 25% through the year. You can see the total operating revenue there is 24.7% of our fiscal year budget. And as mentioned, that's what you would tend to expect, although as I will talk about in the next few slides, we actually are a few percentage points behind on our water revenues, as we would expect those to be a little higher than the linear trajectory at this point of the year. Looking down to the capital revenues there, we basically have two primary sources of our capital fund revenues. That is our fire flow fee and our CMF, or our capital maintenance fee. Fire flow comes to the district as part of the property tax collection, so we have not seen any revenues there. We expect to start seeing those in November as property tax payments begin to come in. CMF revenues are tracking about where we'd expect this time of the year at 22%. And so those are, again, tracking to where expectations are. Again, bottom line, early in the year, 3 months, we are close to, on a linear basis, where we would project to be. As I mentioned, water sales revenue has been the focus of discussion here for the last few months, as we've seen a significant decline in overall production or demand, however you want to look at it. This chart shows just pure production going out in terms of consumed water by the district. And as you can see there, we are 24% behind where we were pre-drought back in fiscal year 2021. This is through September of the year, so this is all adjusted for the first 3 months to give a good comparison. I think, despite the kind of the continued trend of being significantly behind where we were pre-drought in the last cycle, I think the one bit of silver lining here in this slide is that for the first time in a few months, we actually are starting to track ahead of where we were last fiscal year. So you can see fiscal 23 is 5,900 acre feet through September, whereas last year at the same time we had 5,700 acre feet of water consumed by the district. So a slight uptick in comparison to last year's trends, which is good news for the bottom line. I would note too that on these slides going forward, you can see there at the bottom, our billing cycles, which is what informs the majority of the data I'm sharing with you today, is on a 2-month lag. So a lot of the results we're seeing, even though they're coming to us in September, really represent June and July and parts of August. So we're still really looking at the summer consumption patterns at this point. This takes a little bit of a deeper dive into the 3 major components of our water revenues. Water sales are listed there on the left-hand side of your screen. Those are our volumetric or kind of variable revenue source. And then the other 2 are service charge and our watershed fees. The 2 of those are fixed fees. And so those come in on a much more kind of regular pattern. As we talked briefly about last month, you do see in terms of the monthly budget, a little bit of a variance between each month. And that is just based on the geographical kind of patterns of our meter readers and how we get our collections in on a bi-monthly cycle. So one month is a little bit heavier than the next month. So we are here at the 3rd month of the year in September. And I'll draw your attention down to kind of below the bottom line totals for this month. I added 2 data points in there for a % of the fiscal year budget and then a % of the monthly budget. And so I'll explain what those are. The fiscal year budget is just linearly speaking, how are we tracking towards getting to the end of the year? And as you can see there, 25% for water sales, 22.4 and 22.8 for our 2 fixed fees respectively. It seems like that would be on track. However, as I mentioned, the data we're looking at here is for the summertime use. And so we do produce and deliver more water in the summer than the winter, as which makes sense. And so really, if you look at the monthly budget, what we expect to get each month, we should be closer to 30% of the fiscal year. And so I did another calculation at the bottom of this slide that shows where we, in comparison to what we would expect on a monthly basis. And so you can see there that we're actually about 17% or 16.8% behind the monthly expectations. So we're at 83% of our monthly budget. And so that tells us that we're, again, in that, 16% behind our pace. And that really starts to inform our projections going forward in terms of where we'll end the year. So service charges and watershed fees, both of those are tracking much closer to 100% of our expectations, 98% in each category. So that is much more in line with where we'd expect on a fixed fee basis. Did you have a question there, Director?
I did. It just, what would our normal percentage of fiscal year budget be for this billing period?
So a normal % of fiscal year budget on water sales would be about 30%. So, in terms of the first 3 months of the year, we're 5%, we're tracking 5% behind, and on that measure, and it translates to 83% of the total.
So which is your 16 to 17% reduction?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. I got it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So this chart here on the next slide starts to really track this, kind of linearly, or not literally, but graphically throughout the year. And we've still overlaid the fiscal year 22 results as a comparison. And you can see that last year, at the beginning of the year, we were tracking closer to budget. We really started to diverge from the budget at about this time. In about October, November, and December, we started to really see that gap. And that, again, was expected, and that was kind of intentional as we were, heavily into conserving water and then trying to make our way through the drought before the first rains had come last year. So this year, on the right-hand side, fiscal 23 water sales, you can see we started on a very similar pattern in the first 2 months of the year, and we're actually tracking a little bit closer to the budget. It's hard to tell on these small, divergences here so far, but again, I think we're $3.1 million below where we'd expect to be, and so that's kind of the key takeaway here is that we're $3 million as of 3 months behind our revenue targets, and so that's about $1 million a month of foregone revenue that we're not seeing here. Although the good news is we're a little bit closer to the budget than we were last year. So we are hoping that trend continues and hoping to see a much kind of tighter disparity between budget and actuals as we make our way through this fiscal year.
Can I just ask you, Brett? I mean, I totally understand the points that you're making, but I mean, I think we've had a lot of conversations about how this, and we don't know whether these reductions in demand are permanent or if this is still, there will be some sort of bounce back from the drought. But I mean, I think there's been a fair amount that's established that, a business model that's based on increasing supply is perhaps not in the best interest of the district or its ratepayers, just what we've seen in terms of these numbers so far. So doesn't this really suggest the need for a different business model, right? I mean, if we're looking to have a more sustainable level of demand, I mean, I'm just concerned because I'm hearing you looking to that sales revenue, which of course we do want to ensure the fiscal health of the district. But we also do want the district to be on a sustainable path, both financially and in terms of the supply scenarios.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And you're right. It's been an ongoing discussion here, I think, in many forums. And from my perspective on the finance side, that's what I'm trying to offer here today. But I think you're right. We're trying to find a balance in our business model, as you mentioned, in our rate structure, to where we can be much more sustainable in terms of covering the cost of providing the services that we do. And at the same point, we're not just trying to increase demand for overall water, because we need to balance our water supply for our community as well. So it is a tight balance. And I think I mentioned last month that the budget numbers you're seeing here, as part of our 2-year budget, were set essentially 2 years ago before the drought started. And so there is, a bit of adjustments we need to make in the next budget cycle. And as you're pointing to, I think we also need to take a pretty close look at our rate structure to make sure that the structure of our rates are matching the demand patterns we're seeing from our customers.
Yeah, I just want to make sure, because it just sounds, and I know you don't mean this way, but just to be clear, it sounds like you're saying we sure want to be selling a lot more water, and we certainly want to be meeting demand. But if demand is going down, if it is reducing, that's actually in the best interest of the district in terms of its long-term financial picture. It is less expensive to reduce demand than to layer on supplies. Although, of course, we must say it always, again and again and again, we do need additional supplies. But it does seem to suggest, I'm just concerned about the suggestion that what we really need to be doing is selling more water. What I think we need to be doing is adjusting the business model to the realities here. Yeah.
And I agree with you. And I think what I'm trying to say is that it's better in the short term for this fiscal year that we, produce or deliver water kind of consistent with the budget, but that's a short-term perspective on things. And so I think right, as we get into the longer term, we'll have to balance all of those needs.
Okay, well, by longer term, what do you mean by, it seems to me that is a fairly short-term thing, right? I mean, longer term, can you clarify what you mean by that?
All I'm trying to say is that, we have a budget set, on the current, kind of expectations of total amount of water produced or water consumed. And so over the short term, which is in this budget cycle and towards the end of the fiscal year, that's what we're tracking is how much we're actually making in revenue and what our expenses are, trying to make those two as close as we can as possible. Over the longer term, meaning the next 2-year budget cycle and or the next, couple of years, we need to adjust that, as you're implying, to make sure we're matching the best interests of the long-term interests of our community.
Great. Thanks for that clarification. Sometimes people hear long-term and they think you're talking 10 years out, but you're talking about the next 2-year budget cycle. So that's very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. So I'll switch over here to the expense side, as there are definitely two sides of the equation when we talk about finances here. So the past 3 or 4 slides have been on revenue. This is on expense. And I would say that, I think as what you were getting at, Chair Kohler, is that, revenue, our business model on the revenue side, we have about 55% of our fees are variable, 55% of our revenues are variable, the other 45% are fixed. On the expense side, we're a much higher percentage of fixed costs. And so we have less control in a day by day, type of month by month scenario here. So what we're looking at here is, again, 1 quarter's worth, 25% of the fiscal year, how our original budget compares to the actuals. Most categories, as you can see here, are pretty much, again, in line with that 25% expectation, especially on the operating side. You can see the personnel services are the lag there. They're farther away from that 25% mark at 21.3. That is intentional. That is part of our district-wide cost containment strategies, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. But the fact that that is below the budgeted 25%, or the trend we would see, like I said, is intentional and is part of trying to contain costs in the short term here. Our other costs are much more fixed. Our maintenance and operating expense, we can't just pull those back. We need to do the job of the district. Financing costs are set by our debt service. And capital allocation is just a smaller number there, but that is kind of representing a quarter's worth of work that we are able to capitalize through our capital projects. So at the bottom line, operating expenses, 22.4% of the year. That represents some savings, and we are accounting for that in our projections. The capital expenses, the next group down there, both for fire flow and for capital projects, those are not linear in the sense that they tend to be lumpier expenditures. You get either front-loaded and or back-loaded expenditures depending on when we close projects out. At this point in the year, they're both tracking higher than you'd expect. You can see they're 60% and 50%. And that is almost entirely due to the way we carry forward prior year encumbrances and all the contract costs for committed projects from prior years. So those all get thrown in at the beginning of the year, and then they're able to kind of run out. And so when we include encumbrances there on both lines, it shows that we're tracking ahead. But we, in reviewing the projects, we feel like those are still on track to be within budget for the current year. Bottom line, expenditures 34.2 million, represents 28% of the fiscal year, again, in line with where we'd expect at this time of the year. So I'm going to switch over here to our projections, and this, to me, this is the more important slide that we have on here. This kind of takes the, couple of months of data that we have, only 3 months so far, but it also takes these trends and starts to put them into how might we end the fiscal year. And so we've been showing your board, 3 different scenarios throughout the fiscal year, based on what's kind of beyond our control, which is the level of demand or level of consumption of water. So water sales revenue loss is at the top line there, and under the 3 scenarios of whether we are closer to that 25% reduction mark that we had over the summer and into last year, or whether we're closer to 20% or maybe 15% as we end the year. So it's given us a range of where we might end the year in terms of revenues. Anywhere of a revenue loss between 15 million and 9 million. The next group of items you see on this slide here are our unbudgeted expenditures. And so the first line is a savings. And so that's personnel savings. We're expecting at least $4 million this year in personnel savings coming from delayed vacancies and open positions. That helps offset some of these other items here that may come into play. And I just want to highlight for your board that this is not necessarily committed or guaranteed expenditures as you're looking at the water purchases or the pumping of Silahule. Those are monies we're holding aside in case we need them. So we need to prudently plan for, in case we don't get the rains we need this year, we need to import more water from Sonoma and or go ahead and go through the pumping process at Silahule. So we're holding those monies aside in the projection formula here just to show how that might end the year if we need them. And we've been experiencing that the last point there under the unbudgeted expenditures, which is additional paving costs. Those were new costs to the district that were outside of the budget process last year, as we were having to spend more money on paving when we do have to repair pipes across the district. And so we've seen those costs come in. Those are more likely to be needed or almost guaranteed to be needed this year as we're seeing more and more evidence of increased costs for paving. So bottom line, when you take the savings from personnel costs, the potential need for additional water supplies, and then our paving costs, we're expecting to have about $4 million, or we're planning to at least need $4 million this year in unbudgeted expenditures. And so if you take that combined with our revenue shortfalls, the projected operating income, not a great number, a loss of anywhere between 19.6 million and 13.5 million. So if you kind of average that out, that's again, a little more than $1 million a month, maybe $1.5 million a month at its highest, which is kind of essentially the district's, operating deficit right now. That leaves us in a place, if you look at the bottom lines there in terms of fund balance, in a place where if we just took those numbers as they are, we'd end anywhere between $7 million and $13 million in our unrestricted reserve. We are also employing the tactic of delaying some capital expenditures and using our CMF fee or capital maintenance fee to pay for our debt service. And so once we complete that transaction at the end of the year, we're expecting to have unrestricted reserves, as it shows in the bottom, of between 16.6 million and 22.7 million to end the year. I would note that those levels are pretty thin. They're not really comfortable levels to be at. So we'll have to work with the board and in terms of setting the budget for next year to rebuild those reserves. They typically need to be, about $20 or $30 million higher than they are shown there at the bottom line. So we'll have to factor that into the next budget cycle and how do we rebuild those reserves and to what pace and how quickly we rebuild them. But we know that those reserves there are not sufficient over the long term. So we'll have to spend our time thinking about the best trajectory to rebuild that reserve line.
Brent,
Sure.
to just stay there just for a second, because I absolutely agree with what you're saying about the reserves. At the same time, I have real concerns about dealing with our budget, balancing our budget on the back of staff. As you're probably aware, we've lost a lot of staff, especially senior staff. I'm hearing quite a lot about, decreased morale and anxiety. There seems to be, very significant challenges at this point with staff really bearing the brunt of these issues as positions, as you indicated, have not been filled. So I appreciate that as the finance manager, we're basically telling you to do everything at once. But I'm wondering So while I completely agree about rebuilding the reserves, I'm wondering if this is the right time, right time to be doing that, in light of the need to really address some of these personnel issues, because the district runs on its people, and its people are leaving, and the people are are demoralized, and people are concerned about their futures and their livelihoods. That's not in the best interest of the institution.
Yeah, no, and I think you're making a very good point. I think, we are a service-based organization, and we need a well-staffed organization here in order to provide the services we do provide. I think, one point to make here is that we're starting from a pretty lean position, right? We cut positions, in
Exactly.
prior budget cycles, we have not added them back. There's
Yeah.
not a lot of room to really, hold a lot of vacancies without seeing the impact. And I think, that's what you're speaking to, is that there is real world impacts to holding these positions vacant. And I think we're aware of that. We're trying to find that right balance, that there's a trade-off, in all of these, kind of decisions. There's a short-term and long-term. There's, capital projects and deferred maintenance versus staff. And really, I think the hard part here is that we're seeing such large numbers on the revenue side in terms of a shortfall, that there's really only one or two strategies that match that in terms of scale and magnitude. And those are our staffing costs, which are about 50% of the district's budget, and then our capital investments, which is another 15 or 20%. So those are the big buckets we have to use in this time. It's not sustainable. I would agree with you. We can't rely on that forever. And so we're going to have to essentially, work to fix the budget balance, not on the backs of staff, as you mentioned there. But in the short term, that really is one of our only, real effective strategies in the sense of matching the revenue loss or mitigating the revenue loss. And so we're going to have to continue, to evaluate each vacancy, case by case. It's not like we're having no hiring. We are certainly, filling positions that are, critical need, but we are looking at each vacancy as a case by case basis, and to prioritizing accordingly and making sure we're filling the critical needs. But we are watching this each month, and I think to your point that we are seeing increased turnover is certainly something we're keeping our eyes on. And so leading into my next slide, which is kind of what you're talking about and what I began to address here, is we have different approaches to address this financial strain of ours. Some are more short-term in nature, and some are more longer term. If we decide to balance the budget over the next 2-year cycle, or in the future, using those type of strategies. And so again, if we have a delayed recruitment process, we can generate about $4.5 million or $4 to $5 million of savings that way. Again, not sustainable, not something you would like to lead with. Similarly, on our using our CMF or our capital funds to pay for existing debt service requires us to scale back on our capital investments. And I think similar to the lean kind of staffing model that we start with, we're also very far behind in our deferred maintenance and a lot of our needed capital investments. And so making that decision to reduce our CIP by $5 million at least each year is really not a sustainable strategy either. It's something that gets you through a year or two, but it's not something that can really last a longer term without having more detrimental and probably costlier impacts down the road. And so those are definitely short-term strategies, and I think those are things we don't want to have to rely on over the next budget cycle and rate cycle. Over the longer term, we can make service level trade-offs and service level adjustments. So we can reduce customer service levels. We can review our revenue enhancement options, which would be increasing fees and/or looking at property that the district owns to be able to sell. And we can utilize our bond financing for capital projects. And then we spend a lot of time here at the district, going towards a CMF model where we cash fund our projects. We have the option of going back to bond financing. So that's something we can look at, if that makes sense over the long term, or maybe a hybrid mix of the two. Also, we're certainly trying to leverage any available grant and loan opportunities throughout the various federal and state agencies. And then, as we have talked about, and we're beginning the process now, we're conducting a cost of service analysis to really try to, make sure that our rate structure and the way we generate revenues here matches the demand levels that we're seeing. And so, that's really kind of the playbook for now at this point in the fiscal year. And those are the options we're implementing and exploring. Again, a mix of short-term and long-term as we try to rebalance the books here.
Brent, when you say conduct the cost of service analysis, that's really the prelude to the rate increase that a number of us have been saying for some time that we obviously need. Can you provide some sort of preview about the the levels of rate increase that you anticipate will be coming? I assume this is within the next year.
Yeah, so we're just at the beginning stages of that, and so we're working right now with a consultant to really get a handle on what the longer term projections are and what the right kind of mix of rate adjustments might be. And so I don't have much of specific updates for you now, other than to know that what I've talked about in the slides before, where we're essentially in $1 million or so a month deficit. We need to close that gap, and so that gap needs to close. We've had last year we used a little over $20 million of our reserves. This year we're tracking towards, again, close to 20. So we need to close that gap, and that can come from a variety of ways. And it's something that we need to take the time to really study it and find out how we're gonna reset the budget. And it's not all just revenues. I mean, there are things we can do. We want to make sure we're leaving no stone unturned and making sure we're finding efficiencies in the district's operations. And again, leveraging some longer term and shorter term strategies to make that more kind of an equitable distribution of our costs across our rate base. So it's something we're looking at now. It's something we'll bring to your board over the next few months, and certainly as we get into the spring, we'll keep your board apprised, and we'll make sure we are like I said, looking into all possible options of how we can rebalance the budget.
Right. I mean, obviously we want to look at both sides of the ledger, but I mean, the resource side seems pretty depleted. Again, I think, we've got some fairly significant challenges with people leaving. I mean, it's a fairly large exodus that is, beyond what you would normally see. And so I've got concerns about that. We're certainly hearing from staff about a level of demoralization, based on the lack of resources. So sure, let's keep looking for efficiencies. But as you said, it's a pretty lean organization. So it does seem that on balance, we really need to be looking at the revenue side. I know a number of us have been talking for some time about rates. I'm glad that, as you said, that's underway. I'm a little sorry it didn't happen sooner. I mean, we all knew this was coming. This is what always happens in droughts. There's nothing unique or historic about this, event at all. This is what happens in droughts. You sell less water. Again, that goes to the need to revamp the business model. But I'm hoping that the emphasis will be on the revenue side. And utilizing, going to the bond market is definitely a place we should go. I think we've been pretty good about leveraging grants and loans. There is a massive amount of federal funding now. And of course, there's a massive competition for it. But there are a lot of pots of money out there. So I hope that that we're taking full advantage of that. I have every confidence in Matt Seguez. He seems to be doing a good job. Are you including this line because you think there are opportunities we have not yet pursued effectively?
No, not at all. I think we're like you mentioned, Matt Seguez is doing a great job. I think the district staff is definitely well into the process for securing grants and/or loans. A lot of these take time, right? When you're dealing with FEMA, you're dealing with other agencies. They take time to secure. We're in competition with every other water district, and as you mentioned, drought is not unique just to MMWD here. We are in the same boat or same position as many of our sister agencies out there. What I would say is that the difficulty here is that for us, in some of these cases, when we're using our reserves and when we're seeing revenues go down, it may be harder to qualify for grant or especially loan opportunities, because if we can't make our side of the 50% match, or if our numbers aren't looking good in terms of our overall revenues and expenses, it's hard to make a loan for us. And so I think right now we're focusing on some of our bigger projects that are really critical for emergency preparedness. We're looking through the FEMA route. I think that seems to be the most promising for some of the grants that we need for our big projects to backfill our reduced capital spending. And as we go forward, not only do we have last year's infrastructure investments at the federal level, but as more and more state and other buckets of money are out there, we're just continuing to explore those and continuing to work through Matt Seguez and through the board contacts and making sure we're maximizing all of our opportunities.
Okay. The other thing to think about is that the federal government has made, in terms of getting money fast, the federal government has made a big commitment with this Justice 40 initiative. It wants 40% of all of its dollars, not just water, but water is definitely among them, to be dedicated to supporting environmental justice and disadvantaged communities. So to the extent that the district has opportunities to go for collaborative grants with other Bay Area entities, whether Sonoma or North Marin, whoever, with some sort of, to address those issues in particular. There's been a lot of concern, for example, in Marin City about infrastructure there. So that would seem to be a place that the grant opportunities under the Justice 40 regime could happen fast. Anyway, so there are those opportunities, and I don't think they're all long-term, and I don't think they all require 50% match. Some do, of course.
I would just also echo, I mean, there's a lot of things I would just say, echo with what Director Kohler just said around the vacancy rate. I really would like actually us to make a more concerted thought decision around what we are doing with that number, whether we are going to just continue to punt the 4 million. Now it's going 4 to 5. I feel uncomfortable with us pursuing a path where we're with every vacancy, we more or less kind of see that as a savings, and we're almost making a default decision not to rehire, probably in a lot of places where maybe it's not critical, but it's still a very important position. All of our positions, I think, are important. I would assume that. And so I would like to see us not have this short-term savings increasing, because I don't think I worry about the sustainability of our district and our staff and morale and many other things. So I'd like us to change the way that number is going, and maybe make an assumption that we are not going to have that go further, but have that number reduce, and that increases our expenses. But I don't think we should be going deeper by any means. I also want to just flag that the state too has a lot of money for fire and for water and for watershed restoration, other things. So if there's, if we are at all in any way a bottleneck, if there's, I know that going after a lot of these opportunities that are out there, it's a big increase over what there has been previously. If our staff are just overwhelmed and don't have the ability to go after all this money, we ought to really find a solution to that, if that is a bottleneck, because we're a penny, we might be a penny short and missing out on, millions of dollars. So I would really encourage us to look at, whether we're going after all the money that we possibly can.
I'm confident that we are, Monty, doing that. I think Matt has this under control. Ben and I met with the folks in Washington and had a long discussion about this issue. I am critical of the idea that the business model isn't correct. The issue I see is that we were unable to apply the drought rate to the bills because of the 218 process. That's what triggered all of this, to my mind. Using the reserves is perfectly normal. I mean, they're called drought reserves. They were called that for 50 years, and we used them during the drought. And I appreciate, Brett, your comments about, having less reserve than you'd like to have, but there is no magic number to that amount. We've been searching for that since I've been on the board, a solid recommendation of what is the appropriate amount of reserves to have. We have arbitrarily set goals of up to 6 months, but it's a complicated subject, because how much money should we sit on of the ratepayers in reserve? It's tricky. So I do appreciate what's going on, and I think we all have to remember this is a business, and you control the pieces of the business that you can control. The first one is employees. And while Cynthia's right, it's not perhaps fair to put it on their back. It's just a reality of doing business. And you've got to keep in mind that it is a business. It's an awkward business because it functions with a non-linear approach. We can't just increase rates like a business might do. We have to go through a process to do that. So it slows things down in terms of being able to fix short-term problems like this one. But I am confident that this will resolve itself over the next couple of years. I don't see it as a crisis. It's an unfortunate situation, but it's just because of some technicalities that we were unable to apply those rate increases, which would have been done routinely based upon the normal triggers.
So Larry, let me just say, I agree with everything you said. I think we actually should rename the drought reserves. I think you're correct. We use them in the right way at the right time. And I agree they need to be replenished. And I also agree with you about the technicality on the rate increases. All of that said, I do think that there is a fundamental problem with the business model that has such a large gap between the way that we collect our revenues and our fixed costs. All that means is that we're going to continue to have these issues over time. And remember, all of the rate increases we're talking about now, to my understanding, do not include at all any of the new water supply augmentation projects that we all agree need to be planned for and executed at some point. So while we're agreeing, I guess, about 80% of it, I think the real issue for the board going forward is the business model, because I think we're seeing water agencies, cities and towns all across the West realizing that the primary focus on volumetric sales, which is the subject of every single one of these meetings, of our finance committee meetings, they're not matching up. And it doesn't make, and you're correct, it's a business. It doesn't make sense as a business model. So I think we have a friendly disagreement about that. And I'm sure the board will continue to have that conversation going forward. But I don't want to let it go, because I think we have talked about this over time, but we keep not really changing the business model. We've made modifications like the CMF, which is helpful, but I just don't think it's really going to solve the problem in the long term. So I think it's something the board needs to continue to talk about with management.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in.
Have at it.
I don't see the vacancy policy as being, a long-term policy. We're in a funding gap because of the drought. That's what we're dealing with. And this also reflects the PAYGO policy that was enacted 3 years ago to go to a cash basis, which I was reluctant to do, although I see the advantages of it. But I've always been a proponent of doing a more mixed funding, using more bond debt funding and PAYGO. And I think that's kind of going to be the key to getting us to a more sustainable model. Some of our big projects, especially, maybe we should be categorizing projects depending on their size, debt versus PAYGO. But I think while I agree with the capital maintenance fee, I think we need to make a policy to employ debt for some of these big long-term projects, which will free up some cash flow. So again, I think what we're dealing with, I agree with Director Russell, President Russell, that we're dealing with a funding gap, which was born of an emergency drought situation. I do not see delay in filling open employee positions as being a long-term strategy. I see it as being an emergency strategy, which we've employed to kind of get through this crunch. And I think we're going to have to deal with it as we go forward in our cost of service analysis, which is coming up in the next few months. And it's not going to be easy, and it's going to take a lot of public communication and outreach to the public again. But I really fundamentally disagree with saddling or straitjacketing water agencies in Prop 218, but I guess I can't change the law. It just seems like an impossible straitjacket for such a fundamentally fluid, pardon the pun, a revenue situation, which we're dealing with. We're dealing with managing a resource. We're not selling a commodity. And I think that's the fundamental contradiction that we're trying to deal with. And it's it's a very difficult one and it's not an easy one, but I do see our current situation as being a gap caused fundamentally by a budget we passed 3 years ago, which we're going to need to reform.
I guess I want one point I want to touch upon, because I think again we're learning here, and what we will do going forward with budgeting, I think, and with our long-term budget is we'll need to learn from the past. But you know, if our drop in staff right now is because of a budget shortfall, we created the drought funds in order to cover this drop. So it didn't cover, we're not, if those funds are meant to be there in order to allow us to continue our customer service in our district at the level that it was, then we should be using those monies to backfill those positions. If we didn't create that fund big enough in order to be able to do that, then we should know that as we go forward, or whatever financial mechanism we put in place going forward, so that when we do have years where we don't sell as much water because there is a drought and people do what we ask by conserving, we're not needing to balance the budget by losing staff.
I agree with you completely, Monty. Those are excellent points. Again, it's a little more complicated than that. Remember, we also have COVID to deal with, and the impacts that kind of started this problem really before the drought issue hit was people weren't paying their bills. So that's put vibrations into our system. And, you know, I am totally supporting Ben and Brett in this, putting the brakes on right now to not expend more of the reserves. You know, I've run a business for 40 years. I know exactly what it takes to run a business. And if you run too lean on cash in the bank, you can get into real troubles real quickly. So I support that approach. There is no magic number. You know, should the reserves be 6 million, 16 million, or 26 million, or 56 million? You know, it's just a number, and it has serious impacts, but it is something we have to adjust to. And I agree with you. You know, we're dealing with a once in 1,200 year drought. That's not the normal contingency that is put into drought relief funds. So we're just in kind of a perfect storm in the worst way of everything's hitting us at once. And I think the key thing here is we just got to buckle up and hang in and weather the storm, and we'll get through it. And I think those comments that Larry made were excellent about a commodity versus a resource. I think those are right on. You know, I don't know, Cynthia, how much further we can go in changing the structure from the sales of water to the fixed fees. We're already getting pretty good heat over that, but it's worth considering. I agree with your thoughts 100%. I think you might find there's less disagreement between what we're saying than what you might be hearing. So anyway, food for thought.
I think that's always the case, and I don't want to spend too much time on this. Maybe just a couple more thoughts, and we can let Brett finish up. I really want to say I agree with Larry Bragman, and if there's something we could do about Prop 218, that would be fantastic. But unfortunately, we're stuck with it. And then, I think maybe just, and this is a nuance, I think we've always done a mix of pay-go and bond financing. It was just a matter of, you know, and it's a balance. You know, during my time on the board, we've always done. Sometimes we've been a little more on the bond side and, you know, on the debt side, and sometimes more on the pay-go side. So I think we're just going to continue that dance. I think, you know, support for that mix is where, at least in my experience, the board has generally been. So it certainly seems like it's time to be looking at, you know, some opportunities for new bond financing, especially to deal with the capital backlog that we haven't been able to, you know, go forward with for all of the reasons we've all been talking about, or at least not at the levels we'd want to. Obviously, we have been going forward with them. And on the issue of, you know, one thing that, you know, a number of have said, I think you've all heard me say this over and over again. I think we all are very much in agreement that we are not selling a commodity, even though that is really the way that our finances are set up, as if we are. And I agree that it's a resource, but beyond that, what we're really financing more than anything is infrastructure, right? I mean, that is the main thing. We are much more like electrical utilities that has really been acknowledged across the water sector. What people are really paying for is not the molecules of water in their bathtub. It is the massive amount of infrastructure it takes to move that water from the reservoirs, from Sonoma through the system, clean it, treat it, move it to that bathtub. And that's the fixed cost. That's what really does not matter or change. There's no savings because, people use less water in that respect, right? All of that infrastructure still needs to be upgraded, maintained, operated. And that's the reason for my suggesting some further shifts in the business model. But
Yeah, and
as I said,
don't,
that's going to be a long-term conversation.
and don't forget, we uniquely have green infrastructure
Precisely.
in Marin Water.
Right.
So, that is a huge benefit for the community,
Right.
but it's also a fixed cost that we can't ignore.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
there's a lot of complexities, but I do feel that mixing our use of bond and pay-go is going to be a very critical area of examination to sort of hit both ends of the model of not going too far into debt, but using debt to our advantage to stretch and leverage our capital.
Right. Okay. With that, I feel like it's almost 10:20. We should let Brent finish up.
Thank you. And I just have just two more slides here, and these I think were largely covered by the discussion, so I can not spend a lot of time on them. But in the last finance committee meeting, this board asked for a little more detail on the staffing situation. And so the slide I have here just outlines our current 10 or actually 11% vacancy rate as of September 30th. Separated these by division just to give this board a little better sense of where the vacancies lie currently. You can see that they're spread throughout the organization, not overly concentrated in one area or another. However, engineering, you can see down there, the second from the bottom, does have the highest current vacancy rate at 16%. And then just kind of note within that, engineering also oversees our IT department. And I think IT has probably a disproportionately higher vacancy rate at the moment than do other departments. And so bottom line, we have 241 budgeted positions. 214 are still filled, 27 are currently vacant. Of that, I think we have about half of those are currently in recruitment, so they're not vacant forever, but they are moving forward. We are seeing, as mentioned a few times here, increased turnover in the last couple of years. And I think us, as many other not only special districts and water agencies, but just government agencies and employers overall are seeing a mix of turnover for a variety of reasons. Number one, the baby boomer generation is still kind of retiring out. COVID certainly shifted expectations of work and shifted the way we can work and how many people are willing to commute versus telework. I think that made an impact on turnover rates. And then I think, one thing that at least I've seen kind of in my prior experience is the new generation of staff, kind of the millennials or whatever you may call them. They are not as apt to stay with an agency for 10, 15, 20 years as maybe they were a generation or two ago. So we're kind of seeing turnover at various different levels for a variety of reasons as we're kind of coming out of this pandemic and out of the emergency. So not unlike other agencies, but this is the way it shakes out now currently. And again, I think I've heard your board voice concern over these vacancy levels, and I think we'll try to make sure that over the longer term, as we get out of this kind of short-term funding gap, that we do our best to fill those vacancies as quickly as possible.
Brett, I have a comment on this. There's a lot being displayed here in this table. The thing that jumps out at me are the two that really get the financial end of our business working and the health and safety, which are finance, administration, and operations. Those are the two we need to keep our eye on. The other ones, water resources, watershed resources, engineering, I'm not exactly sure what watershed resources are. I guess that's rangers or something. Haven't really heard that term before, but those are more future, with the possible exception of the watershed resources. But water resources and engineering are dealing with the future. The other ones are dealing with the present. And so these should be kind of, I think, ranked a little differently, because there's parts, if you can't get your bills out, you're in deep trouble. And if you can't get the water treated, you're in deep trouble. If we don't get the engineering done this year, it'll get done next year. You know, you've got to look at this in proportion. But that's where I think the emphasis should be on, is those two particular groups are critical to our ability to provide safe, healthy.
Yeah,
drinking water.
Director Russell, I agree. I think this has been a good discussion on all perspectives, and this has been a very, very difficult issue for me and for management as we review every position, because every position does have impact to the organization, the work we do, and the others that are carrying additional work. So I really appreciate the comments from the board in that regard. I do want to say that probably most of the operation positions you see are under recruitment, because we are losing some very key, some very senior people in operations that have a lot of institutional knowledge, and it's concerning, but certainly those positions need to be filled. So what we aren't bringing what we're filling and what we aren't, and all the details, but we did want to, we of course can do that at some point, but we did want to get a little more granular for the board on where the positions are falling.
And Ben, of course, that issue you're talking about has been talked about in the water industry for the last 20 years, of what's coming with respect to the cliff of
Right.
retirees, and how is that going to be addressed. And so far, I don't know how we're addressing it, because I haven't seen anything with hands-on to that. But I think the industry hasn't done anything except talk about it. And
Well-
the problem, well, let me finish. The problem is that everybody's in the same boat.
Yeah.
You know, so we're losing senior people to retirement, as are all the other water agencies. So it isn't so much that you can reach out and get one of those people. I mean, you know, I'm a T3 in this loop. I probably get 20 pitches a month from various water districts. Come join us, come join us, come join us. And I can only imagine what the higher levels are seeing. So anyway, that's just it's just a phenomena of the time and the age. And I think, you know, post-war and post-World War II, baby boomers and all that junk it's coming to fruition.
I don't want to belabor this, but I mean, yes, of course, everything you're saying, Larry Russell, is correct. But, and I might be misinformed, but my understanding is that, you know, we are in a somewhat unusual situation. I mean, absolutely, you're totally right about the silver tsunami. Everybody's leaving, you know, retirements and all that. But my understanding is that we are in a somewhat unique situation given the pace and the depth of people leaving. You know, that could be a mistake, and I certainly don't want to waste staff's time figuring it out. But it seems a little unusual compared to what I'm seeing across the sector.
I think the difference, Cynthia, at least in the operations side, is that we just have less operators. You know, we're smaller. And so a one, I mean, look at the numbers. We have 86 or 97, you know, and I actually don't know how many someone like East Bay Mud has, but I have to envision it's more like 500 than 100. And
Yeah.
LA Water and Power, you know, so one drops off from us and it's a percentage of change in our staffing.
Yeah.
So you're right. But, you know,
I'm just saying, if you talk to staff, there are a lot of concerns, Larry. There are a lot of concerns, and the morale is low. I think the IT department is down by about 50%. I just don't want us to paper over what's happening here. Okay.
I'm not trying to. I'm just trying to indicate that, you know, it is a problem across the industry.
Right. Yeah.
And I throw it out more as a caution to, are we going to be able to fix it? Because I don't necessarily see a pathway to fix it, because like I say, everybody's in the same boat, and the industry's been talking about it a lot, more 10 years ago than now. but it's been kicked around. But like I said, I've never seen anybody come up with a solution because I'm not sure that there is a simple one.
Could I just make one comment? As we go forward in our next budget, I think we have to budget for full staff for 241 employees. I mean, we're gonna have to look at full staffing to do our financial planning. So I don't think we're gonna be moving forward with the expectation of having reduced staff. So, you know, I do think we're dealing with a temporary situation. I do think it's having a real impact, a real world impact on our staff, on our human resources, which we all know are the key to our operations and our success. So that's kind of where I want to leave it. I'm not looking at an austerity budget going forward on the backs of the employees. I think we need to plan to fully staff this agency.
Okay, Brett, we should let you. finish up
The
so we
final
can get
slide
to
here, to your point, just summarizing what we talked about today. So again, you know, we have a funding gap and financial challenges last fiscal year continuing into this year. The ultimate severity will depend on, you know, a variety of factors, you know, the variable factors we've talked about, rainfall, water conservation and demand levels, and, you know, to what level we need to utilize unbudgeted expenditures to make it through the year. And we are taking targeted actions in both the short and in the short term, and we're evaluating our long-term options, you know, as we've indicated here in this discussion, to inform the budget process for next year. So that is my final slide. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to you, Chair Kohler.
So we've had a robust board conversation. I'm going to ask the board's indulgence to leave it there so that we can get to public comment.
Yes,
Okay,
we have
thank you.
one public comment, and I just want to remind the public you have 3 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Larry Menekes.
On public comment, well, I'll start off by giving my impression, which is yikes. And as a member of the public, listening to the head of finance say several times that this is not sustainable is really, really concerning. I agree with a lot of the comments that have been said and disagree with a lot of the comments that have been said. And the slight approaches to address the financial strain is just really, really concerning. Instead of seeing slides as to how we get to solution, how do we solve this? And speaking to the drought and COVID as the cause, I believe is incorrect, because those are symptomatic. Those are symptoms of a larger problem that has been going on for quite a long time here. To Director Kohler's comment about the business model, and that the business model needs to be revised, because we're in this position not because of this short-term crisis that we're in, but it's long-term, where we've been losing staff for years, we've been cutting back for years. You know, we always use the Rangers as one of the indicators, where we had 12 Rangers in 2000. Now we're down to, what is it, 4, 5, 6, and we're losing them. We're probably going to have a couple of them retire. And again, that's institutional knowledge that it will take a decade to regain when we hire people. But what we really need to see are what are the real solutions to this in the next finance meeting or in the next board meeting? How do we work within the 218 process next year to get ourselves to to a healthier position, to address these critical staffing needs that are being spoken here? So I just want to emphasize that the drought is not the cause at all. It's just a symptom of a larger problem that we really need to solve. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Larry.
The next 2 speakers, Roger Roberts and Aaron Burden. Go ahead, Mr. Roberts.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can, Roger. Good to sort of see you. Good to hear you.
It's clear that the agency is operating currently below break even. But I haven't heard much about what's going to be done about it, other than to agonize and to point out areas of difficulty. So I'm looking forward to this board and the future board addressing the solutions, as Larry indicated just a moment ago, to get above break even so that you can actually achieve what needs to be done, not only with existing operations, but future operations that will allow for the creation of a 4-year supply of water. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Burton, please.
Oh, hi, yes. Good morning. I'm Alan Burton. I'm a field representative with SEIU. I just want to say thank you for this robust discussion this morning. I just simply wanted to reach out to Director Russell. We've been trying to get in touch with you to talk to you about staffing. And I think that brushing off staffing is just a fact that the workforce is changing. Younger people tend not to stay as long. I think that's not what's happening here. I think it's much more complicated, and we've been trying to reach out to you a number of times to speak with you. So when you have time, please, I'll reach out once again, and hopefully we can set up a time to talk. Thank you.
More than happy to.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. There are no further speakers.
Okay, let's move on then to the next agenda item, which is the quarterly investment report.
Thank you, Chair Kohler, and that's me again. I just have a very kind of brief presentation here on this item. I'll put a summary slide up here for you. So each quarter we come to the board and provide an update on where we're at with the district's investments. The slide here that I'm sharing for you, it kind of shows the good news, and that is that our effective, interest rate, or earnings rate has been increasing. I think this board is aware that the vast majority of our investments are stored currently within LAIF. And so you can see that the chart there on the right-hand side showing the effective yield of LAIF over the last year. The majority of last year and then going in, 2019 and 20, we were talking about returns of, 0.2, 0.1, very small returns in the low rate environment. As the Fed has been increasing, the interest rates, we're seeing the effects of that here. And you can see the kind of continual run up from, the 0.3s back in March. We ended the fiscal year in June, around that 0.8, 0.9 level, and we're continuing to see our yields rise, currently at 1.5. And the way this works is that 60% of LAIF's investments are in treasury securities, and they have various maturities. I think the average maturity right now is 300 days, so 10 months or so. So they have a variety of short-term and long-term investments that they're managing. As that kind of yield curve is turning over, we're seeing the benefits of that. Albeit not quite as quickly as the rates are increasing from the Fed, but we are seeing the benefits of that to our portfolio. So the chart on the right there shows the LAIF returns, the overall yield curve, which is an interesting kind of portrayal of what's happening in the investment markets there, is on the left-hand side. That compares where the treasury market yield curve was last year in the blue in the bottom to where it is now, significantly higher, certainly in the short term, where it was essentially zero. If you look at the 3-month and 6-month rates last year in the blue dots, now we're looking at short-term rates in the 3s and closer to 4. Similar in the longer-term securities at 4.2 and 4.25 as you look out in the 2 and 3 year and the less liquid options. In terms of how that affects our portfolio, I have the key figures there at the bottom. Our beginning balance to start the year was $67 million in terms of all cash on hand. We ended the quarter at $58.7 million. So again, we lost about $10 million in the first quarter. That's not a true loss, though. We do have some kind of front-loaded expenditures that we have to pay for, primarily our debt service and our unfunded liabilities for our retiree benefits for our pensions. And so those we have to pay in the first month of the year. So we do expect to kind of be out a little more cash for the first quarter. We did earn interest earnings of $179,000 there, which is a significant increase compared to the prior year. So we are seeing the gains of this higher interest rate market. Unfortunately, we are having dwindling reserves, and so that's essentially muting some of the effect that we could otherwise get out of this market. What I would also say is the more the lower our reserves go, the more conservative we have to be. So we really can't take as many chances out there, and we need to maintain our liquidity. So we really can't take advantage of those kind of longer dated, less liquid investment vehicles at this point. But as we, kind of take a look at the longer term strategies, and as the market is shifting around us, we will continue to kind of make adjustments as we can. Obviously, keeping in mind that our primary goals here for our investment portfolio are safety, liquidity, and then that's followed by return and yield. So happy to take any questions. This staff report is there. But again, I think the headline here is that we are seeing increasing rates of return on our funds. At the same time, we're seeing a lower overall fund balance or reserve level for a variety of reasons as discussed here. So I'll go ahead and turn it back to you, Chair Kohler, or anyone else on the board for any questions.
Thanks very much, Brett. Board questions on this topic?
Yeah, it's interesting, Brett, because with inflation at 8% and the yield at 1.5, I was thinking about whether it's better or worse. When inflation was 2% and the yield's 0.2, it's not good, perhaps, looking at it that way. But at 8% and 1.5, that's not good either. Huh? Where you're basically losing money by keeping it in the bank. And
that's true. And kind of what you're getting at is that concept of real rate of return, right? Kind of what return you're getting versus what you're losing in inflation. And you're right, it's almost worse for us now, in terms of the overall kind of, business of the district, where our costs are going up by 6, 7, 8%. We may make a little bit more in the investment markets, but it's not covering our kind of inflation drivers for the cost of business. So we're not gaining any ground in that respect. And so I think that's a good point to make.
Yeah, it's obvious, but just threw it out.
Yeah, one quick question, Brett, on the amount of the reserves. Our total cash position of 58.7 million obviously is more than our unrestricted reserves that were referred to in the first discussion about our available reserves. And I'm just wondering, what are the other reserves that are reflected in the 58.7 that are not included in the previous description of available reserves?
Yeah, so we do have 3 or 4 different reserves, and kind of as they're typically classified, you have restricted reserves, you have committed reserves, and then you have your unrestricted reserves. And as we talked about in the last session, our unrestricted reserves, kind of what we call our drought reserves, and or to cover miscellaneous things that may happen throughout the year that are not budgeted. And or to kind of weather any kind of economic and or drought cycle until we can get to the next opportunity to reset the budget and or the rates. So the other reserves that we do have are either legally required and or the prudent reserves. So we have some reserves set aside to make sure we can make one more year of debt service. So we have about $10 million each year in debt service. We're required by bond covenants to hold at least 1 year aside for that. We have reserves set aside for in case there's an earthquake or a flood or kind of significant damage to district facilities. We have reserves set aside for any litigation or lawsuit that may come our way. We review those each year to find out, how much we may need to hold back to pay for either future litigation and or current litigation, similar to workers' comp type things. So we have a variety of, those kind of reserves that are required and or best practice to hold those to pay any obligations that come our way. We also do have what we call our pension rate stabilization reserve that was established a couple of years ago, as well as what has come down in our rate stabilization reserve, which have been used. Also, the rate stabilization reserve was used. The pension stabilization reserve has not been used. So those are set aside for specific reasons, not related to just kind of general operating business. And so that's kind of a summary of the other reserves.
Okay. Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any, it looks like there's no further board comments on this. Any public comments on this item?
There are none.
Okay, I think that brings us to our last item, which is updating the records retention schedule.
Yes, good morning, Chair Kohler and directors. Before you is the update of the district's records retention schedule. The district retains its records according to a retention schedule that is in compliance with state and federal laws. Periodic updates to the retention schedule are important to ensure retention periods reflect changes in law, reduce current and future record storage needs, improve efficiencies in retrieving records requested by the public, eliminate filing and storing of duplicative records between departments, and recognize advancements in current technology. As part of this records management project, the district contracted with Gladwell Governmental Services to work with staff in updating and improving the district's record retention schedule. In addition to the proposed updated schedule, staff is also requesting the authority from the board to make minor and occasional updates to the schedule as needed, and is proposing that a full comprehensive review and/or update of the schedule be brought to the board every 5 years. But for today's meeting, staff is requesting that the Finance and Administration Committee refer this item to the next Board of Directors meeting for approval of a resolution. And this resolution would rescind the district's resolution number 7507 of the prior 2004 records retention schedule, adopt this new schedule, and authorize staff to approve minor updates until it needs to be brought to the board for a full review, which will be every 5 years. Any questions?
None
have a
from me.
question.
Other board, other, oh,
I
sorry.
do have
go
a,
ahead, Larry.
I do have a question. Are we talking about retaining paper records or these digital records?
Both.
So, you know, it's a real concern of mine, because I've seen in actually Superior Court, they changed their records retention policy, and I've run across instances where there are no records available for cases that need to be reviewed. So I'm a little bit concerned. I haven't really looked at it in detail. And I'm fine pushing it forward to a board meeting, but it's just a concern of mine if we're dealing with digital retention, how much it would really cost us to keep our records, if not permanently, but longer maybe than is on the schedule. And I haven't looked at it in detail, but it is a concern of mine. I don't really know if it's applicable to this agency, but anyway, it's kind of a bigger topic than it appears on the surface. So I appreciate you bringing it forward.
It is, Director Bragman, and there's different ways to look at it. Many agencies are looking at it kind of as a liability to be sitting forever on all these records and not knowing what's really there. And you get a request and, 20-year-old record, it should have been tossed long ago. So anyway, there's that view too that agencies take in thinking about, not keeping things forever.
Yeah, I mean, are we under statutory guidelines for records retention?
Yes, there are. The records retention schedule does point out how long the records are supposed to be kept. And there is a column that says, like, by this law or according to this statute, we are supposed to abide by that. And then also to, I'm sorry.
That was me sneezing, sorry.
Oh, bless you.
Yeah, I would just add that we do have statutory requirements for minimum retention periods in many cases, and then there's some discretion. But it is a balance. We want to be efficient. We don't want to, as our general manager said, retain things forever and lose track. We want to know what we have. There's also a process for how we go about reviewing requests for destruction, and we actually have a process for retaining a log of what's been destroyed. So helps us kind of keep a handle on that. But we do want to be efficient in how we manage our records, and also have an idea of what we have and what we don't have.
Yeah, no, I get that. I got to tell you, I've been very impressed with our staff's ability to pull records from well beyond records retention. So I just had an experience where they pulled the records for when we sold the land for Deer Park School 60 years ago.
And those are the types of records that we would keep. Some of them we would keep permanently. So real estate records are records that we do want to have in the long term. So some of the records you'll notice if you look at the schedule, we do keep permanently. And then others, there's really not a need to do that. So it really is kind of culling through and thinking about what makes sense in each case.
Yeah, it's just so inexpensive to keep things digitally. Anyway, I'll fly spec it and get back to you guys. At the next meeting.
That's exactly right, Larry. It's welcome to the world of engineers. One thing that engineers share pretty much across the board is anal retention of stuff. When I first joined the district on the board in 2005, there were a series of flat files and file cabinets in the hallway going to the bathroom. You know, that hallway outside the boardroom, we walk down. On the left-hand side, there was, you know, people don't realize how much it costs to store files. If you look at dollar per square foot, you know, it's $100 a month per file or something like that. And they basically were digitizing everything. And I agree with you. I think the hard part about keeping the digital record is knowing what you have.
Yeah.
Not having it. You know, if we need another hard drive to store that, we need to buy another hard drive to store it. I think we should be extremely cautious with discarding anything. Now, that's my engineer side speaking. I know in my own business, we retain at least 20 years. Lawyers retain at least 20 years or forever. You know, forever. Yeah. I mean, you send it to those Iron Mountain places and you pay the rent and you never look back, right? You may never ever touch it.
Nope.
But it's there if you need it. And it's a very tricky part of doing business is deciding on that. You know, you can take, I know we had a tumble with CH2M Hill recently on exactly this subject. And Jacobs, their new owner, has a very rigid policy on records retention. At least that's what they say they have. Now, they're engineers too, so I'm suspicious. But, you know, they used it as to say, well, we don't have it. Yeah, maybe they don't have it. I don't know. But engineers in general, we like to keep everything, especially drawings and things like that, where we're probably never going to use them. They're probably totally irrelevant, frankly. That, you know, the chance of using is 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, but we just have this need inside of us to hold it. So that's what you're seeing is we don't want to not have it. That's kind of the general description I would give of engineers, just FYI. But your thoughts are right on.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to retain as long as we can, but we'll talk about it again, I'm sure. So,
of course, there's also the decay of digital storage and things like that that are longer term issues that they don't talk about too much, but it still happens. No. And nobody knows what that number is either, you know, for sure. So.
Okay. So it sounds like we're referring this to the board.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. I think that is our last agenda item.
We do have one public comment.
Public comment.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. Public comment, of course.
Roger Roberts, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, sir.
Hey, Roger.
Yep, I had to unmute myself. There's a question of what is the essential institutional knowledge that you need to keep, especially if you have, over time, new boards who don't have the institutional knowledge that some of you have because of your long-standing experience on the board. So in terms of what you should keep and not keep, I think it's important to err in the side of keeping the records because that's all part of institutional knowledge that will help other board members and other managers in the future to look back and see how did we solve a similar problem previously. So I would, like Larry says, err on the side of having more information in storage than not, because that's the only way you're going to be able to retain institutional knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you.
To that end, Roger.
That's a great point, Roger. Thank you.
To that end, I believe we still have the audio recordings of the board meetings since Cynthia and I joined the board.
And what a delight for everybody those will be.
But my point is they still exist.
Right.
They converted from having the tapes, which they used to have the little mini cassettes, and they had boxes and boxes of those. They got them digitized and they started using a digital recorder somewhere around 2010 or something like that. So it changed the nature so they could then store them on hard drives. But to my knowledge, they still exist. I could indeed be wrong, but that's my understanding.
No, they do exist. They're in our
Yeah.
content server.
Yeah.
Well, I think
Yeah,
all of the constituents who are in touch with me about listening to all of our meetings are really going to want to know that. I think we should. It's amazing how many people listen to these meetings. I have to say, this is a separate subject, but once we go back, or once you all, I should say, go back to in-person meetings, I hope they'll continue to be recorded, because it has been very interesting to me how many people are willing to spend the time to listen to these meetings in their own time, in the comfort of their own homes or offices or cafes or whatever. So
I'd also like to say, Cynthia, kudos to Larry Bragman. I didn't see the value of having the video recordings when we pushed them through, but Larry was exactly right. And perhaps he foresaw COVID, I don't know. But since we've had the Zoom meetings, it's been a very valuable tool for the public, especially. For us, it's live for us, so it's less of an issue. But for the people who can't attend live or aren't able to do it, it's extremely valuable, Larry, and I thank you very much for pushing us in that direction.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a
Okay.
good change.
yeah, I agree. Any other public comments?
There are none.
Great, then I think we are done. Terry, there's nothing else we need to do here?
That is correct. You all agreed to move it, so that's good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Everybody have a
Okay.
great rest of your Thursday, and take care.
Thank you.
Later.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks.